We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
It started as a battle for freedom.
I never assumed I was a second-class citizen.
And evolved to a fight for equality.
We assumed we had the right to be there. And because we had the right to be there, we were going in that door whether they wanted us in that door or not.
The civil rights movement gave a voice to thousands of people, including many in North Carolina, who were burdened by social injustice.
We needed to be on an equal footing as American citizens.
But what has changed since 4 young men dared to challenge segregation laws by sitting at a whites-only lunch counter? Who has continued this battle since one man had a dream?
It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream.
And how can we heal a divided nation when the echoes of the past still reverberate today?
No justice! No peace!
We'll explore all those questions on this special edition of Capitol Tonight. Good evening and welcome to this special edition of Capitol Tonight. I am Tim Boyne. We are coming to you this evening from the original St. Joseph AME Church here in Durham. It was built back in 1891 and one time was known as one of the most prosperous African American communities in the entire country. Tonight it's the setting for a discussion on race and civil rights. This is the culmination of our Black History Month special, Carolina Courage, the Fight for Civil Rights. Joining us for our roundtable discussion this evening, Mr. Howard Lee. He's the first Black Chapel Hill mayor and first Black mayor of a predominantly white city in the South. He's also a former state lawmaker, state board of education chair, now has an education nonprofit in his name. Michelle Lanier is a director of the African American Heritage Commission, an oral historian, and has a family with a long background of civil rights in North Carolina. Dr. David Forbes grew up near Shaw University in Raleigh, attended segregated schools. Later, he helped organize sit-ins and demonstrations. He was the first protester to be arrested in Raleigh and is now retired from the ministry. Jessica Holmes is a Democrat, a Wake County commissioner, an education and law attorney born and raised here in North Carolina. And Dr. Ada Fisher is a retired physician, a GOP National Committee woman who grew up in the Durham area as the daughter of Reverend Miles Fisher. Her home was the site of many organizing meetings. She grew up in a segregated Durham as well. We want to sort of talk about this from the past, the present, and the future perspective. So let's start with you folks and sort of your biggest memories about growing up and coming of age in the civil rights era. Dr. Fisher, tell us some of the memories that stand out the most about growing up in a segregated Durham.
Well, I never saw Durham as being segregated because we were fortunate. We had all kinds of things and exposures. We had our own stores, we had our own hotel, we had North Carolina Central and all kinds of things that fed into the Black community. And much of what went on had its beginnings here. You know, the Royal Ice Cream Parlor on Roxborough and Dowd Street was where the first sit-ins were in North Carolina, not A&T. And people ask me all the time about Martin Luther King coming to my father's church, White Rock, but there was something even more important in Durham that occurred, and that was there was a doctor here named Dr. Vincent Cordes, and he was the doctor that took the knife out of Martin Luther King at Harlem Hospital when he was stabbed. And it sort of got lost in history. Had it not been for Dr. Cordes, who's from Durham, many of the things which occurred after that from Dr. King probably wouldn't have happened. For me, it was a royal time because we got to see all kinds of things and meet all kinds of people. Asa Spalding used to make sure that all the people from Washington, etc., made their appearance here. Every governor in the state of North Carolina came to speak at my father's church because they wanted the black vote, and we had about 1,500 members at one time. So we had a lot of things that we saw. We had good schools. There was nothing like Hillside High School. We were not second class in any sense of the word. So it was a great opportunity. My father was sort of a pro-black man. He was not an integrationist. He believed that if black people integrated, we would lose our schools, we would lose our principals, we would lose all that we have. And much of what he said has happened.
Mr. Forbes, what was it like organizing these sit-ins and to be arrested? The first one in Raleigh is part of it. What was that like?
It was heady. I was 19 years old, so I really did not fully appreciate the implication of what I was involved with. But the sit-ins were a dynamic movement, that many young people from Shaw and St. Aug picketed the stores to desegregate them. We could go into the variety stores and buy books and paper and pencil and shoes, but we could not. We could smell the onions from the hot dogs from the lunch counter, but we were not allowed to. So it made a big difference in changing things. As a matter of fact, I'm of a mind that had there not been the sit-ins, there would not have been the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Had it not been for the sit-ins and the students who were willing to go to jail and demonstrate, would not have had the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And if it had not been for the Voting Rights Act, there would not have been a Barack Obama, in my view.
Did you grasp sort of the history that was in the making, and what was that like being arrested? I mean, were you scared? Were you determined? What was that like?
It was very dangerous. We had no way of knowing how the poor whites from Carly, that's a poor section of Raleigh, would respond. They did come and intimidate us, but fortunately nobody was hurt or killed. It was not scary to me. I had the full support of my parents and the black community, and we braved it, but we had no way of knowing where it was going to go. It eventually broke down many of the walls of segregation. Unfortunately, the good folks on Jones Street, who are in the Aura Party, are trying to get us back into the tobacco fields and the cotton fields. They want to turn the clock back. But we used to sing, "Oh, freedom over me, before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to be with my Lord and be free."
Mr. Lee, running for mayor for Chapel Hill, I know you have stories of being chased down the street by a Klansman. I mean, what was it like trying to break that barrier?
Well, it's tough. I think there are three events that I describe in my book, The Courage to Lead, that I think profiles the journey from growing up in a small town in Lithonia, called Lithonia, Georgia, near Atlanta, where at age 15, I became very upset about how my parents were being treated. And so I decided to protest by going into a white bathroom and was accosted by a group of Klansmen that really started roughing me up, and I was able to get away. The one thing I learned early on is growing up in the South, you better learn how to run when you get cornered, and I was faster than most people. I learned from that and made a commitment that never again would I be so dumb as to take the system head on, but I'd learn how to maneuver around the system. That didn't hold because in 1959-60, I was stationed in Fort Hood, Texas, near Killeen, and asked for a cup of coffee in a drugstore, was turned down, and decided to organize a protest with a group of soldiers. As a result of that, I found myself, this was on a Saturday, on Monday I was on a plane being shipped to Korea, where I was shipped up to the DMZ. And then of course, finally coming to Chapel Hill, after graduating with my master's, my wife and I decided we'd rather stay in Chapel Hill than move to Durham, which was the place basically chosen by most blacks coming into this area. We thought it'd be easy to buy a house in liberal Chapel Hill, which we found was not true. And we ended up being threatened after we bought the house in east side of called Colony Woods, and our children were threatened. So that journey to me, certainly at each step, had an impact on my life that changed me as a person, but also made me more determined and forced me to become more of a role model for many people and mentor people.
Michelle, obviously a different time that you grew up, but do you feel like you still face discrimination, or how was your upbringing? I mean, obviously it's different than what these folks went through, but do you still feel like African Americans still face discrimination growing up in the modern era?
So certainly I have had a chance to bear witness to the stories of my elders, and I'm just so honored to be here with you. That's part of my calling as an oral historian, is to listen to these stories. And I've had a chance to hear those stories and experience some of my own. I grew up hearing about my grandfather, who was part of the Great Migration out of the South, lived in Philadelphia and went to Central High there and was expelled because he decided to display an image of a lynching victim and refused to take it down. And so his family sent him back down to North Carolina to be educated at Mary Potter. in Oxford, a black boarding school. I've heard stories of my great-grandfather, J.W. Jurgen, and his daughter, Effie Jurgen, who were very influential in Raleigh, making sure that Chavis Park was not called just the Negro Park, but was named after an African-American man that they felt the children in the community could look up to as a point of pride, a Revolutionary War hero, an educator. And so I was raised by people like my aunt, Grace Thompson, who taught right here at Hillside in Durham, North Carolina, and her husband, who was one of the lawyers who defended the protesters of the Royal Ice Cream Sit-In. So my family has been stitched through with Bennett Bells, who also participated in the Greensboro sit-ins. So yes, that's a part of my legacy. It's a part of my heritage. I believe it's a part of the heritage of any human being who steps foot on the ground, the sacred ground of North Carolina. It's important to pause and think about the history of segregation, integration, protest, human rights, civil rights. In terms of my own experience, not only do I have what I call ancestral memory, to think about what my family could and could not access, but certainly there have been times where I didn't feel comfortable. I didn't feel that I was being treated as equal. That's one of the reasons I decided to attend a historically black college. I went to Spelman College so that I could have some sort of respite from that.
Jessica, how about you? How about, as an African-American woman who's run for public office, have you felt like you faced discrimination in trying to reach your goals?
I am keenly aware in most rooms that I'm in that I am sometimes the only person of color. Sometimes I'm the only woman, and sometimes I'm the only person in my age group as well. Particularly for individuals in my age group, I think it's important that we understand whose shoulders we stand upon. Because there was a first black mayor of Chapel Hill, I, as a young black woman, was able to become a commissioner, the youngest ever elected official in Wake County's history. And I think it's important for young people in particular to know our history and to build upon that history. I have been explicitly called out of my name, and I've had the N-word used directly towards me. And so oftentimes I have to wonder when opportunities aren't afforded to me, is this because I am young? Is this because I'm a woman, or is this because I'm an African American? Whereas my counterparts don't have those same worries. I attended an integrated college. I went to UNC Chapel Hill and I went to UNC Law. And so I still understand that there's been a lot of progress, because there was a time when I would not have been able to make the decision to go to a primarily white institution. But those opportunities are available to me today because of the work that came before me.
Coming up.
There are those who want to turn the clock back. There are those who argue that there should not be affirmative action.
Let's talk about where we are. When the three of you did what you did and went through what you went through, and the dream that Martin Luther King talked about, where do you think we are compared to where you hoped we would be back then?
I think we've made tremendous progress, and I think we have to be appreciative of the fact that we have seen a lot of the barriers torn down, a lot of doors open, and a lot of opportunities made available. I'm often asked, what do you think is the most important outcome of the civil rights movement? And my response is the ability to choose. You can make a choice today on what you want to be, how you want to be it, and where you want to go. When I came along, didn't have a choice. I had no choice as to what school I could go to, no choice as to what neighborhood I lived in, no choice as to what job I could get. Today I can choose. Now I have to be competitive. I have to be able to jump in and prove that I'm better than other candidates, and it requires a lot more work on my part. But I think as long as you have choice and access, you're eons ahead of where we were before.
I listened at you being Tar Heel. In my growing years, as a matter of fact, through my college years, a black person could not go to Chapel Hill or Duke or North Carolina State in Raleigh. Everything was proscribed by race. As a matter of fact, North Carolina was so racist that it had 3 levels of education. There were schools for Indians, There were schools for black folks, there were schools for white folks. There were libraries for Indians, libraries. That was the kind of world that I grew up in. And so I think that we have come from a long ways, but I shudder when I look at the political machinations nationally and here in North Carolina, the good old state of North Carolina. There are those who want to turn the clock back. There are those who argue that there should not be affirmative action. There are those who argue that there ought to be barriers to voting. Looks like there's an effort to turn back the clock on the ability to have the franchise.
Dr. Fisher, you probably disagree on something.
I disagree wholeheartedly with a lot of things that have been said, but you know, when I look back at a segregated time, I was one of the earlier people who went to the University of North Carolina at Greensboro because we couldn't go to State or we couldn't go to Chapel Hill if you were a woman. And so you had to spend the first 2 years at Chapel Hill and at UNCG and then transfer to those two things. There were 52 people in my class. Only 17 of us survived and graduated. Now UNCG has the best record of graduation of any school in the United States. 60% of people who come who are black and go to UNCG will finish within 6 years. No other school in the United States has that good a record. And I'd like to think that some of that was because of what we did. I remember Whitney Young, and Whitney Young said, what good is it to be able to eat in a restaurant if you can't afford the food? The part that we have lost is the economic part of it. Some of us have done well, but too many of us have not done well. And part of that not doing well is we are not able to navigate what's coming in the future, to foresee the kinds of challenges. We have people who need to prepare themselves for the future, and the future is not rap and the rest of it. The future is space, it's the ocean, it's new technologies that have not even been developed, and I don't think we are prepared, and I don't think some of our schools are preparing our students to deal with a future in which they will have economic parity, and we are certainly not there yet.
Still to come.
If you know your history and you know what's going on today, there are a lot of parallels that are very alarming, particularly as it relates to voting rights and particularly as it relates to education.
We have still had in recent years law enforcement, the African American community. We've seen the high-profile cases in the Black Lives Matter movement. How do you think your generation views race now and in the future in conjunction with the Black Lives Matter movement?
I think race is becoming more complicated. I think in this new realm of technology, social media, even pushing against, to use a Black Lives Matter phrase, respectability politics, to say, you know, if someone is a hip hop artist who has tattoos and piercings, can they not still have a voice and be seen as someone who can be a leader in the community? There are all of these different paradigms that are being shifted and questioned and changed. So I think it's an exciting time. But I also see some of the people who are involved in civil unrest, civil rights, they are looking back to the past and they are thinking about what was going on with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you know, what was going on with SELC, and what were some of those strategies? What can we take from those that will be relevant to today? And I know for me, in terms of being a witness to this, also I have a teenager who's learning about this and thinking about ways to be involved. I would love to shift the conversation where instead of thinking about in this linear way, how far have we come and why are we still struggling with these issues? Issues of inclusion, diversity, racism, it is an everyday tending, every moment. It begins within the heart of a human being, it begins with relationships, but it's not something that we can check off a box and say, oh, we had this person elected, or we achieved this thing and be done. I think it's unrealistic. It's a part of the human nature that we will always be struggling with these things. And I think that if we can take it in as this is a part of something that we need to be tending to every day in a conscious way, I think that we will move a lot farther with this work.
Is the Black Lives Matter movement moving forward the civil rights in this country?
I believe it is. I believe the Black Lives Matter movement is an important movement. I also believe that the Blue Lives Matter movement is an important movement. I am the eldest of 5 children. I want my brother to come home safely at night. In the same vein, as a Wake County Commissioner, I want to make sure that all of our sheriffs and all of our police officers, they come home at night as well. I think part of the confusion and the tension is that people are pitting the two movements against each other. But I believe that Black Lives Matter isn't necessarily to the exclusion that any other lives matter. It's just the fact that in this moment, in this time, it's Black men that are being gunned down. It's Black women that are being gunned down. And as we talk about sort of knowing our history, it's concerning to me as a young person who does know my history to see some of the things that are coming out of our state right now. As an education law attorney, we're seeing regressive policies as it relates to education. As a first-generation college student who credits education for my ability to be who I am today, it's concerning to me when I see that our public schools are not adequately funded and that we're in a situation where we're potentially facing the resegregation of many of our schools. So if you know your history and you know what's going on today, there are a lot of parallels that are very alarming, particularly as it relates to voting rights and particularly as it relates to education.
Dr. Fisher, you're the Republican here. You see things much in a different lens than a lot of the folks here. Why do you see it so different?
People talk about voter ID as being repressive, etc. I disagree. You got to have a voter ID to go to the doctor. You got to have one to get into a school to get your kid out. You got to have a voter ID for anything. So why would we say you can just show up and vote and nobody checks to see who you are? People would also say that education, I'm a big believer in education. I'm a licensed school teacher. I think that it's important. But we spend 57% of the dollar in North Carolina on education. You got to pay for bridges, cops, etc. And the question is, how much money do we have to spend, or do we keep raising the taxes? I'm a taxpayer. I don't want to pay any more money than I have to for things. I believe that Black Lives Matter has a place. I got two sons who are hip-hop, whatever, generation. And they keep me challenged all the time. And they have some interesting views of stuff. And I'm going, who's paying for it, dear heart?
Coming up on Capitol Tonight.
I'm not sure we can solve this problem simply by passing legislation.
Welcome back to St. Joseph's AME Church in Durham, where we continue our discussion about the past, present, and future of civil rights in North Carolina.
We have to learn from history and not be enslaved by it. You go back, it was Republicans who actually, after Reconstruction, opened up the system so that people, especially Black people, could have an opportunity to advance. But you only have to remember the 1898 Wilmington riot to recognize how quickly things can turn and how Democrats came in at that time and started passing Jim Crow laws. And now, fast forward, Democrats have been the most progressive in terms of trying to open things up, and now we look across the country and we find Republicans passing all of these different restriction laws. So if we don't teach kids the history of how we got here, we won't recognize when history is being turned back. And it's nice to have protests, because I participated in protests, but there has to be a plan, because protests are only a means to an end and not an end within themselves. And if you don't have a plan for where you're going, you're not going to stop this retrenching as it's starting to come. And I get tired of people saying, you know, we're hopeless, we can't do it. If that's the attitude, then you're already doomed. I'm never going to stop believing that I control my destiny. And education is the key.
Are affirmative action policies still important?
I believe that they are. A university in Washington, D.C. acknowledged that they participated in this sale of slaves to finance George Washington. They have agreed to own that, and they have done research and gone to New Orleans to find the offsprings of those slaves, and have said that any of those persons can go and get tuition-free opportunity at George Washington University.
One of the things we're missing with our children, and I tell my sons that all the time, is they got to want to step in the door. You can open the door all you want, but if they don't take the step in, you know, people criticize me for being Black and Republican, and I say, if everybody plays in one party, when the other party's in power, who you got to stand up for you? And I take a lot of flack from Democrats, from Republicans, from Black folks, white folks, etc., for what I believe in, but I believe in what I stand for. And I'm not going to let Republicans willfully walk over black people to get where they are. But black people also have to realize we have institutions worth saving. I've been a big advocate for historically black colleges. I give $100,000 to the historically black colleges, and I didn't go to any of them. But for me, it's important that that door be open, because if that door is closed, I guarantee you these white institutions are not going to continue to let us in.
Let's talk about the future a little bit here. Pew Research Center last year released some numbers from 2014. Home ownership rates for blacks was 43% compared to 72% for whites. The median household income for whites was $71,000 compared to $43,000 for blacks. Michelle, how do we tackle these disparities that still exist?
I think that it's really important that we listen to these younger generations. I'm really impressed. I have a sister who is a millennial. I have a daughter who's a teen. I have a chance to teach as an adjunct at Duke, and I am really impressed with some of the creative strategies that they have created out of necessity, particularly those who are in their 20s right now that came into the professional workforce during the Great Recession. I think that there's some non-traditional ways that they have become entrepreneurial that are not really held up to a spotlight. So I think more gathering together and listening, what lessons have they learned, what successes, and some of them are becoming homeowners. I'm watching some of these 20-somethings saying, this is how you do it, and they're reaching back and they're teaching each other through social media. They're talking to each other about building wealth, but these aren't the stories that are being elevated. So I think that we need to dig beneath the static of what we think is happening. It happens every generation, where the older generation believes that the younger generation isn't ready or isn't, taking on the wisdom. But there's a lot that's happening there that I think actually harkens back to some of the older modes of survival of African Americans during Jim Crow era, of saying, I'm going to create my business. I'm not going to wait for anyone to create it. I'm going to make it, because that's how I'm going to feed myself.
You are a former policymaker. These issues have been tackled for some time. Why are they not working, that these disparities are being reduced even further, and what needs to be done, do you think?
Well, I think that we fail to recognize that, number one, I still go back to education, because that's where I spent most of my time in public office working, is that when I grew up, I went to a segregated school, never had a new desk, never had a new textbook, never had enough materials, but what I had were great teachers who made me believe in myself and who took what was given to them and they used it to elevate people like me. I came out of an uneducated family except for my mother. The only person who really preached education to me was my mother, and she came out of a broken home and got her degrees through correspondence courses and went on to ultimately teach for 36 years. My father was not educated and certainly didn't have an appreciation, and a lot of people discouraged that. So I think when I fast forward and look at a lot of the kids today, these kids are coming out of poverty areas, they're coming out of uneducated areas, they're coming out of areas where the role models are drug dealers and crooks, and they don't have any people who are reaching down and trying to give them a helping hand. I'm not sure we can solve this problem simply by passing legislation. I think we have to recognize that although we do need to build bridges and roads and all of these other things, if we don't pay our teachers to go into the schools and touch the lives of these young people, what we're going to do is continue to end up building prisons. And we've spent a lot of time doing that. But if we don't have the leaders willing to stand up and fight against these policies, and we're not going to win all the battles, then I'm not sure we're going to make it the progress we want.
I would agree with that fact that education is key. And not only that, it's the great equalizer. That's what it was for me. And we're going to make the investment in these kids one way or the other. We can either build schools and fund resources and pay our teachers well, or we can build jails and pay prison guards well.
We're unfortunately out of time, but how about this? We shouldn't just do this conversation in Black History Month. We shouldn't just do it when there are issues within the Black community. So let's do this every few months if you guys would join us again.
Absolutely.
Love to.